So we're going to go ahead and start our last module. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about one-to-one and inverse functions. This part of the presentation will be focusing on one-to-one. So recall a function is a relation in which each input corresponds to only one output, meaning that our x variables can only appear once, but our y values can appear multiple times. Well, we're going to extend this to what we call a one-to-one function. And a one-to-one function means that each input corresponds to only one output, and each output only corresponds to one input. So if we look at some examples, let's look at the first table. The first table is not a function because notice that 2 appears twice in our x column. Similarly, 1 appears twice in our x column. So this is not a function. Since it is not a function, it is not going to be one-to-one because to be one-to-one, you first have to satisfy the function definition. Let's look at our second table. Our second table is a function. If you look at each x value, they appear only one time, but it is not one-to-one because we do have y values that appear multiple times. 2 appears twice, as does 1 as well. If we look at our last table, this is a function because each x value only appears once. It is also a one-to-one function because each y value appears only once. All right, so those are some tables. So now let's talk about graphs of functions and one-to-one functions. So when we talked about functions before, we said that we wanted to use a vertical line test. And remember that if a vertical line crosses the graph more than once, it is not a function. So if we look at our graphs down below, which one is not a function? The first one. If I draw a vertical line through just about almost all of these points, or all of this graph, we're going to see that it touches twice. So this is not a function. And again, since it is not a function, it is not one-to-one function either, so we do not have to worry about the second part of this. Now the second part of this, once we determine whether it is a function, the second part of it is it a one-to-one function. And so we have the horizontal line test to help us out with that. And the horizontal line test says that if there is a horizontal line that crosses the graph more than once, it is not one-to-one. So for instance, which example down here is not a one-to-one function? Well, it's going to be this one here. If I draw a horizontal line through my graph, we see that it crosses twice. So this one, it does pass the vertical line test, so it is a function, but it is not one-to-one. The rest of these examples, if you look at them, these are all functions. and they are one-to-one. So linear equations are going to be functions as long as they are not vertical or horizontal lines, as long as they do have a slope that is either a whole number or a fraction. We also have square roots are functions. We have cubic equations. As long as it is a basic cubic equation, it will be a function. And we also have exponentials. These are going to be functions. Exponentials is something that we will talk about in the next section. Okay, so if we look at some equations, let's go ahead and see what we get. So, the first column, these are not functions. The first equation is not a function because of the y squared. That means that for each x, remember that y squared, you can either have a positive number squared or its opposite squared. You're going to get the same thing. And so for each x, you're going to be mapping to two different y values, which is not allowed. X equals 4 is not a function. It is a vertical line, which means that for when x is 4, y can be whatever it wants. And so notice that for each x, we do not have it mapping to one y value. You have many y values. The second column, these are functions, but they are not one-to-one. The first one is not a function because of the x squared. If we look at x squared, if I plug in 1, that's going to be the same thing as -1. And so we're going to have a y value that appears twice because x equals 1 and x equals -1 are going to map to the same place. The second equation, y equals 6, is not a one-to-one function. This is a horizontal line. This means that for every single value of x, we have y equals 6. So 6 appears multiple times. The last column, these are all functions, and they are one-to-one functions. So linear equations in slope-intercept form can be functions. They can be also one-to-one functions. Square roots, these are going to be functions. This one, because we have an exponent of 3, since it is odd, as long as it is a basic cubic function, it will be a one-to-one function. And the last one is an example of an exponential function, which, as I said, we will talk about in another section. Exponential functions are also one-to-one.